Millionaire married a simple farmer over an argument, and what happened next shocked him. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The evening skyline of New York stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Daniel Richmond's penthouse, a glittering expanse of lights reflecting off the polished marble floors. He stood by the bar, swirling a glass of aged scotch in his hand, the amber liquid catching the dim glow of the chandeliers overhead. This was his world, a world built on power, wealth, and control. At 42, Daniel had everything a man could want. He was the CEO of Richmond Enterprises, an empire spanning high-end restaurants and luxury hotels, catering to the elite. His name commanded respect, his wealth opened every door, and his influence ensured that nothing was ever beyond his reach. He had cultivated an image of effortless dominance, a man who not only played the game but dictated the rules. The party buzzed around him, a sea of tailored suits and glittering gowns, conversations floating through the air like the clinking of champagne flutes. These were the people who mattered, the powerful, the ambitious, the untouchable. And in the center of it all was Daniel, the man they all envied, the man they all wanted to be. It was during nights like these that he thrived, surrounded by people who either admired him or feared him. Among them was Marcus Whitley, his longtime friend and occasional rival, a man who relished in pushing Daniel's limits. Marcus approached with his signature smirk, holding a glass of wine as if he had already won a silent argument. "Still living the perfect life, I see," he said, his voice smooth with amusement. Daniel arched an eyebrow, a slow smile curving his lips. "Would you expect anything less?" Marcus chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. "Not at all. But tell me, don't you ever get tired of it? The same parties, the same people, the same predictable victories." Daniel took a sip of his scotch, his gaze steady. "Winning never gets old." "That's just it," Marcus said, leaning in slightly. "You always win. You've built an empire, conquered every challenge, but you've also insulated yourself. There's no risk, no unpredictability. You're untouchable." Daniel's smirk deepened. "And that's a bad thing?" Marcus's expression shifted, his eyes gleaming with something mischievous. "It's a boring thing. You need a real challenge, something outside your world of control." Daniel exhaled a soft laugh, setting his glass down. "And what exactly do you have in mind?" Marcus tilted his head toward the room where women draped in designer dresses sipped on vintage champagne, their conversations filled with polite laughter and carefully curated interest. "We both know your type, Daniel. Beautiful, polished, well-bred women who fit seamlessly into your world. But what if you had to do something different?" Daniel crossed his arms, intrigued despite himself. "Define different." Marcus's smirk widened. "Marry someone who doesn't fit the mold, someone completely opposite of what you're used to. And here's the catch. You have to stay married for 6 months. No shortcuts, no manipulation. Just you, in an environment where your money and influence won't mean a damn thing." Daniel's expression didn't falter, but something inside him stirred at the idea. A bet. A game. That's all it was. "And what's in it for me?" he asked. Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel like a secret. $50 million worth of investment into Richmond Enterprises. No strings attached. But if you fail, well, let's just say your reputation as the man who always wins will take a serious hit. Daniel glanced around the room, taking in the faces of those who orbited around him. They all expected him to win. They always did. This would be no different. His smirk returned, cool and confident. "You're on." Marcus clinked his glass against Daniel's, sealing the deal. "This will be interesting." The next morning, Daniel instructed his assistant, Victoria, to compile a list of potential candidates. The criteria were simple. She had to be the complete opposite of the women in his world. No socialites, no models, no corporate executives. Someone far removed from wealth and luxury. Victoria, ever efficient, presented him with a neatly organized dossier later that evening. "Here are a few options," she said, placing the folder in front of him. "Teachers, community workers, women in blue-collar industries." But one name stood out. Daniel picked up the file, flipping through the pages until he landed on a photograph of a woman standing in the middle of a sprawling field, hands on her hips, her expression fierce yet unreadable. Her name was Serena Brooks. "Who is she?" he asked. "Owner of a small family farm in Montana," Victoria replied. "She inherited it from her father and has been running it ever since. No ties to wealth, no interest in high society. She's hard-working, stubborn, and by all accounts, impossible to manipulate." Daniel's smirk returned. Perfect. He set the file down, already mentally calculating his approach. She would be a challenge, but that was the point. He would win, just as he always did. What he didn't realize was that for the first time in his life, he was about to play a game where the rules didn't favor him. And before it was over, he wouldn't just be fighting to win. He'd be fighting to understand who he really was. The early morning sun bathed the New York skyline in soft gold, but Daniel Richmond wasn't interested in admiring the view. He sat in his sleek office, flipping through the file Victoria had given him. The photograph of Serena Brooks stared back at him. A woman standing in the middle of a vast field, her strong arms crossed over her chest, her posture unyielding. She was a stark contrast to the polished, elegant women he usually surrounded himself with. Daniel leaned back in his chair, smirking to himself. A farmer. He had never even spoken to someone like her before, let alone considered marrying one. "This will be interesting," he muttered. Victoria, standing across from his desk with her usual air of composed efficiency, arched an eyebrow. "You think you can convince her?" Daniel's smirk widened. "I've convinced senators to bend to my will, Victoria. What's one stubborn farmer?" She exhaled a quiet breath, clearly skeptical but wise enough not to say so. "She's not desperate for money, despite the farm struggling. She's resourceful, independent, and proud. That might make her resistant to your usual tactics." Daniel tapped his fingers against the desk. "Everyone has a price." Victoria hesitated, then slid another document toward him. "I took the liberty of gathering more details. The farm has been in her family for 3 generations, but the last few years have been tough. Her father passed away, leaving her with a mountain of debt. She's managed to keep it running, but barely. She's been rejecting offers from corporate buyers trying to take her land, and she refuses to take shortcuts. If you're looking for someone with an iron will, she's it." Daniel studied the report. Financial strain. Stubborn principles. That meant leverage. He didn't need to charm her. He just needed to offer her something she couldn't afford to refuse. A slow, calculated smile stretched across his lips. "Book me a flight to Montana." The first thing Daniel noticed when he stepped onto Serena Brooks' land was the silence. Not the kind of artificial quiet he was used to in penthouse suites and boardrooms, but a raw, natural stillness, broken only by the rustle of the wind through the fields and the occasional call of distant animals. The second thing he noticed was the dirt. It was everywhere. Sticking to his polished Italian shoes, settling in the creases of his tailored navy suit. He sighed and buttoned his jacket as he walked toward the main house, a modest but well-maintained structure with white wooden siding. His driver had tried to convince him to wear something more practical, but Daniel refused to dress down for anyone, least of all a woman he was about to make an offer to. As he approached, a dog barked sharply, and a moment later the front door swung open. Serena Brooks stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a rag. She was exactly like her photo. Tall, strong, with deep brown skin that glowed in the sunlight, her curly hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. She wore faded jeans, worn boots, and a tank top that revealed toned arms, the kind that came from real work, not hours in a luxury gym. Her sharp brown eyes scanned him from head to toe, unimpressed. "Let me guess," she said, folding her arms. "Another corporate shark come to buy me out?" Daniel smiled, unbothered by the hostility in her tone. "Not quite." Serena leaned against the porch railing. "Then you're lost. Town's 20 miles that way." Daniel chuckled. "I never get lost. I go exactly where I intend to." Her eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't like him already. He could feel it, and it amused him. "Well," she said, crossing her ankles, "if you're not here to buy the land, then what the hell are you doing on my porch?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her. Most people, even the powerful ones, felt some instinctual need to impress him. She didn't. That was rare. "I have a proposition for you," he said smoothly, "one that could solve all your financial problems in a single day." She snorted. "That's cute. But if you think I'm selling this land, you might as well turn around now." Daniel stepped closer, hands in his pockets. "I don't want your farm. I want you." That got her attention. Her posture stiffened, and for a brief second, something unreadable flickered in her eyes before she scoffed. "Yeah, right. I'm serious," he continued. "I need a wife." Silence stretched between them. The wind rustled the porch awning. Somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied. Serena's lips parted slightly in pure disbelief before she threw her head back and laughed. A deep, rich sound that was equal parts amusement and incredulity. "Let me get this straight," she said, still chuckling. "Some billionaire walks on my land, dressed like a damn magazine ad, and tells me he needs a wife?" She shook her head, grinning. "Oh, that's good. That's really good." Daniel remained unfazed. He let her laugh, let her get it out of her system. Finally, she wiped at the corner of her eye. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'm not interested." "It's not a scam," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. You marry me. You get financial security for your farm, enough money to expand, pay off your debts, secure your future. In return, you pretend to be my wife for 6 months. Serena stared at him, and then her amusement faded, replaced by something colder. "You think you can just buy people?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "Everyone has a price." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Wow, and here I thought the corporate world couldn't surprise me anymore." She pushed off the railing and stepped down onto the dirt, closing the distance between them. "You want to use me for some ridiculous game?" she said, "like I'm some contract to be negotiated?" Daniel's smirk returned. "You wouldn't be here talking to me if the offer didn't intrigue you." She stiffened, her jaw tightening. He knew he was right. The farm was struggling. He had done his research. Serena turned away, her arms still crossed. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the battle between pride and necessity. Finally, she sighed. "I have conditions," she said. Daniel's brow lifted slightly. He had expected her to walk away. "I'm listening. If I do this, I run my farm my way. No interference from you, no changes to my operations." "Fine." And every cent you give me goes to the farm, not to personal luxuries, not to anything else." "Agreed." She turned back to him, her gaze sharp. "And if at any point I feel like this arrangement is compromising my integrity, I'll walk away. No amount of money will keep me in this." Daniel studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Deal." Serena looked at his outstretched palm, as if contemplating whether shaking it would cost her something intangible. Then, with a deep breath, she took it. His grip was firm. Hers was stronger. And, as she pulled her hand away, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in his life, he had stepped into a game where he wasn't holding all the cards. The morning air was crisp and biting, carrying the scent of damp soil and freshly cut hay. It was nothing like the climate-controlled luxury of Daniel Richmond's penthouse, where he could adjust the temperature to his precise liking with the press of a button. Here, the cold seeped through his tailored clothes, wrapping around him like an unwelcome embrace. He stood outside the farmhouse, arms crossed, watching Serena as she secured the saddle on one of the horses. She had woken him up at 4 a.m, banging on his door like she was ready to tear the whole house down if he didn't move fast enough. He had stumbled out of bed, groggy, irritated, and entirely unprepared for what she had in store for him. Now, as he stood in the early morning light, he was beginning to understand just how much of a mistake he had made. Serena didn't say a word as she finished with the saddle and turned to him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of something in her eyes. Amusement, maybe, or mild contempt. "You're late," she said, adjusting her gloves. Daniel exhaled sharply, shoving his hands into the pockets of his expensive coat. "It's 4 a.m. On a farm, that means you're already behind schedule." She nodded toward the barn. "Horses need to be fed, then you're helping with the stalls." He stared at her, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he frowned. "You actually expect me to clean up after animals?" Serena smirked. "You expect me to be your wife for 6 months. Looks like we both have to do things we don't like." Daniel clenched his jaw. He had built empires, crushed competitors, and bent some of the most powerful people in the world to his will. And yet, at this moment, he was entirely at her mercy. He sighed. "Fine." Serena handed him a pitchfork. "Let's see if you can handle it." An hour later, Daniel was sweating through his designer shirt, his coat long discarded in a pile of hay. His arms ached from hauling feed bags, his back screamed in protest from shoveling, and the smell, God, the smell, clung to him like a second skin. This was hell. Serena, of course, made it all look effortless. She moved through the barn with the ease of someone who had been doing this her whole life. While he struggled to maneuver a wheelbarrow full of hay, she had already finished 2 stalls and was on her 3rd. He wanted to quit, walk out, call his private jet and be back in New York before noon. But the thought of Marcus Whitley laughing at him, of losing that damn bet, kept him rooted to the spot. Besides, Serena was watching him, and he'd be damned if he let her think he was weak. By the time they finished, the sun had fully risen, bathing the farm in a golden glow. Daniel leaned against the barn door, catching his breath, his hands raw from the work. Serena tilted her head, studying him. "Not bad, city boy. You didn't pass out." He scowled. "I've handled boardrooms full of sharks. I think I can survive a little manual labor." Serena chuckled. "We'll see. Breakfast is in 10 minutes. Hope you're okay with black coffee and eggs. No fancy lattes out here." Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow and forced himself to stand straighter. "I'll survive." He wasn't so sure. By the end of the first day, Daniel was convinced his body was shutting down. Every muscle ached. His hands, unused to anything more strenuous than signing million-dollar contracts, were sore and blistered. His perfectly maintained nails were ruined. And the worst part? He had only completed a fraction of the work Serena had done. She barely broke a sweat, moving from one task to the next without hesitation. By the time evening rolled around, she was still going strong, checking the fences, fixing a broken latch on the chicken coop, and organizing tools in the barn. Daniel, on the other hand, collapsed onto the porch steps, rubbing his temples. "Long day?" Serena teased, walking past him with a bag of feed slung over her shoulder like it weighed nothing. "I don't know how you do this," he muttered. "Every single day?" She smirked. "You get used to it." He doubted that. As she disappeared inside, he let out a slow breath and stared out at the vast stretch of land before him. It was beautiful, he had to admit, the kind of beauty that money couldn't manufacture. But it was also relentless. And he was beginning to wonder if he had finally bitten off more than he could chew. The next few days were no better. Each morning, Serena woke him before dawn, dragging him through a new set of chores, mucking out stalls, feeding livestock, learning how to drive a damn tractor. He was forced to trade his designer shoes for heavy-duty boots, his tailored suits for worn jeans and flannel shirts that Serena had unceremoniously tossed at him on the second day, muttering something about how he looked like a lost city boy. He suffered through every minute of it, gritting his teeth, refusing to let her, or anyone else, see him break. The farmhands weren't subtle about their amusement. He caught them smirking behind their work, whispering whenever he fumbled with something basic. Serena didn't defend him. She didn't make it easier for him. And that, somehow, made him respect her more. She didn't sugarcoat things. She didn't hold his hand. She let him fail, let him struggle, let him earn every inch of progress the hard way. And little by little, something strange started to happen. He stopped fighting it. His body, though sore, adapted. The work became familiar. The farmhands, initially skeptical, started giving him nods of approval when he got something right. And Serena, well, she still smirked at him like he was an idiot half the time, but he caught the way her expression softened when she thought he wasn't looking. It wasn't much, but it was something. The night of the 5th day, Daniel found himself sitting on the back porch, staring up at the sky. The city never let him see the stars like this. Serena walked out a moment later, a bottle of beer in one hand. She didn't say anything, just handed it to him before taking a seat beside him. He took a sip, letting the silence stretch between them. "You haven't run yet," she finally said. Daniel exhaled, rolling the cool bottle between his fingers. "Not gonna lie, I thought about it." Serena chuckled. "Figured. But I don't quit," he added. She glanced at him. "No, I don't think you do." Another long silence. Then she leaned back on her elbows, looking up at the sky. "You ever done anything like this before?" Daniel smirked. "What do you think?" Serena snorted. "Yeah, thought so." He turned to look at her, taking in the way the moonlight cast shadows along her face. She was beautiful in a way he hadn't expected. Not polished, not refined, but real. He shook the thought away. This wasn't about attraction. This was about winning. 6 months. That's all he had to survive. And yet, for the first time, he wasn't so sure what winning even meant anymore. By the second week, Daniel Richmond had stopped waking up in the middle of the night, convinced his body was going to give out. His muscles still ached. and his hands were raw from work he never thought he'd be doing, but the shock of manual labor had dulled into something almost tolerable. Almost. Each morning still started before dawn, the sky barely tinged with light when Serena knocked, no, pounded on his door. His instinct was still to curse her out, to tell her where she could shove her pitchfork, but the words never made it past his lips. Instead, he gritted his teeth, forced himself up, and followed her out into the biting morning air. Something was shifting inside him, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet. At first, his determination had been fueled by pure ego. He refused to let the farmhands laugh at him, refused to let Serena smirk at him like he was some rich boy playing dress-up. But now, as he hoisted bales of hay onto the truck, sweat dripping down his back, something else drove him forward. A part of him, the part that lived for challenges, for proving people wrong, wanted to master this world. Not just survive it, but own it. The farmhands were the first to notice the shift. In the beginning, they had whispered and smirked behind his back, taking bets on how long he'd last. But by the second week, the murmurs had stopped. One morning, as Daniel helped mend a section of the fence that had been knocked down during last night's storm, one of the older ranch hands, Earl, clapped him on the shoulder. "Didn't think you'd make it this long," Earl said, adjusting his hat against the sun. Daniel, breathless from driving a nail into the wood, wiped sweat from his brow and smirked. "Glad to disappoint you." Earl chuckled. "Nah, I respect it. Most rich boys would have been on a plane back to their penthouse by now." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He wanted to say that he wasn't like most rich boys, but the truth was, he had been. Until now. Instead, he grabbed another nail and got back to work. Serena had noticed the change, too. She wasn't the type to hand out praise, and she sure as hell wasn't about to start now. But something about Daniel was different. She had expected him to break, to find an excuse to leave. But he hadn't. He still grumbled when she woke him up, still cursed under his breath when things got tough, but he was trying. More than that, he was learning. She watched as he worked with the horses, his movements still hesitant but no longer completely clueless. She caught him asking the farmhands questions instead of barking orders. And most surprising of all, he had stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes, as if the rest of the world had finally stopped existing for him. One evening, she walked into the barn to find him fixing a broken gate, something she had assumed she'd have to do herself. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "If you keep this up, I might actually start believing you're useful." Daniel didn't look up. "If you keep watching me like that, I might start charging you for the view." Serena scoffed, but didn't fight the small smile tugging at her lips. The first real moment of respect between them came unexpectedly. It was a sweltering afternoon, the kind that made the air feel thick and heavy. Serena had been working with one of the younger horses, trying to get it used to wearing a saddle, but the animal was skittish, unpredictable. Daniel, who had been watching from a distance, stepped forward. "You're doing it wrong," he said. Serena shot him a glare. "Oh? And suddenly you're an expert on horses?" Daniel ignored her sarcasm and stepped closer. "You're coming at it too fast. It doesn't trust you yet." Serena frowned, but she hesitated. Daniel had always been arrogant, but there was something in his tone, something measured, thoughtful. She watched as he moved toward the horse, slower, gentler than she expected. He let the animal sniff his hands, murmured something she couldn't hear. And then, to her surprise, the horse stilled. Serena crossed her arms. "And where did you learn that?" Daniel finally turned to face her, smirking. I may not know farms, but I know people. And trust isn't something you force. It's something you earn. Serena hated how much sense that made. She also hated the way her chest tightened, just a little, at the realization that maybe, just maybe, there was more to Daniel Richmond than she had thought. That night, after the work was done, they sat on the porch again, sharing an exhausted silence. Daniel rolled his sore shoulders and took a sip of the cold beer Serena had handed him. You're not half bad at this, she admitted, staring out at the fields. Daniel smirked. Careful, Brooks. If you start complimenting me, I might start thinking you like me. Serena snorted. Don't get ahead of yourself, city boy. He chuckled, but the teasing felt different now. Lighter, less like a battle and more like something else. Something neither of them was quite ready to name. But the night didn't end with laughter. Later, long after Serena had gone inside, Daniel sat on the porch alone, staring at his phone. He had ignored it all day, but now he saw the missed messages. Emails from his assistant. Calls from Marcus. A reminder of the world he had left behind. A world he would have to return to eventually. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to. The morning after Daniel sat alone on the porch, staring at his phone, he found himself waking up earlier than usual, before Serena could pound on his door like she usually did. He didn't know why. His body still ached, his muscles still protested every movement, and his hands bore the unmistakable signs of days filled with hard labor. But something had shifted. He had spent his entire life chasing things. Power, wealth, control. He had built an empire by outsmarting his competition, by always being 2 steps ahead. But out here, on Serena's land, there were no shortcuts, no boardroom strategies that could help him. He had to work, sweat, and prove himself in a way he never had before. And for the first time, he wasn't thinking about Marcus's bet. He wasn't thinking about New York, or deals, or investments. He was thinking about the work in front of him, about the way the farm functioned like a living, breathing thing, about how Serena handled everything without ever once faltering. And maybe, just maybe, he was thinking about her. Serena had noticed the change, but she didn't comment on it. She had learned over the years that words were cheap. People promised things all the time. Investors had promised to help the farm. Her father's so-called friends had promised to support her when he passed. None of them had followed through. So when Daniel started waking up on his own, when he stopped hesitating before picking up tools, when he no longer looked at his phone as if it held the key to his survival, Serena simply watched. She didn't compliment him. She didn't acknowledge it outright. But she let him work alongside her without complaint. And that, in itself, was a kind of trust. The test came in the form of a storm. It rolled in fast, earlier than the forecasts had predicted. One minute, the sky was a clear, brilliant blue, the sun casting its golden light over the fields. The next, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, thick and angry, moving faster than anyone had expected. Serena knew trouble when she saw it. She had grown up watching storms come and go, and had learned from her father when to take cover and when to fight through. And this one was going to be bad. She dropped what she was doing and sprinted toward the main barn. "Daniel," she called. He was already there, securing the tools, his jaw tight as he glanced at the sky. "What do we do?" he asked. Serena didn't waste time explaining. "We need to get the animals into the lower pens. If the winds get too strong, the upper ones won't hold." Daniel nodded. No argument, no hesitation, just action. They worked fast. The wind picked up, whipping through the farm like an unseen force hell-bent on tearing everything apart. Dust swirled, biting at Daniel's eyes as he moved from stall to stall, guiding the horses, calming the panicked cattle. The barn creaked under the weight of the coming storm, the sound ominous. Serena worked beside him, shouting orders, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. But even she wasn't prepared for what happened next. A sharp, splintering crack split through the air. Serena turned just in time to see one of the fence posts, weakened by age and the growing wind, snap clean in half. The barrier collapsed, and before anyone could react, 3 of the horses bolted, rushing straight toward the open field. Serena cursed and took off running, and without thinking, Daniel ran after her. The rain hit hard, the sky opening up as if the heavens themselves had shattered. The wind howled through the trees, and the ground turned slick beneath their boots. Serena barely noticed. She could see them, the 3 horses, wild-eyed, galloping toward the tree line. If they made it into the forest, they'd be nearly impossible to find before the worst of the storm hit. "Go left," she shouted to Daniel, veering right to try and cut them off. She didn't stop to think about whether he would listen. She just ran. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surging through her veins as she closed the distance. Rain blurred her vision, but she could still see the led horse, the youngest, barely broken in, too skittish for its own good. If she could just get close enough. Suddenly, from the corner of her eye, she saw Daniel. He had moved exactly as she told him to, his body tense, his movements steady. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he reached out, grabbing the led horse's reins just before it could break for the trees. It reared back, thrashing, hooves slamming against the wet ground, but Daniel held on. Serena barely had time to react before she was beside him, moving quickly to calm the others. The storm raged around them, wind screaming, rain lashing at their skin. But somehow, together, they got the horses back under control. By the time they returned to the barn, drenched and breathless, Daniel was grinning. Serena just shook her head. "You're insane," she muttered. Daniel ran a hand through his soaking wet hair, his chest rising and falling. "You're welcome." Serena exhaled sharply but didn't argue. Instead, she reached out, just for a second, and squeezed his arm. A silent acknowledgement. A quiet moment of understanding. And then the moment was gone, because there was still a storm to weather. That night, after the worst of it had passed, Daniel found himself sitting by the fire, wrapped in a borrowed sweatshirt Serena had tossed at him earlier. He stared into the flames, lost in thought. Serena sat across from him, nursing a mug of coffee. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, Daniel exhaled. "You knew what to do, every second of it." Serena didn't look up. "It's my job." Daniel studied her for a long moment. "No, it's more than that." Serena's fingers tightened around the mug. Then, after a beat, she said, "My father taught me. Everything I know about this farm, about these animals, it's because of him." Daniel didn't press, didn't ask for more. But something in her voice told him that this place, this land, was more than just property to her. It was history. It was legacy. And suddenly, the idea of buying her out, of turning this farm into some corporate investment, felt wrong. He didn't understand why, but he knew one thing. Serena Brooks was more than a challenge, more than an obstacle. And for the first time since this ridiculous bet had started, Daniel wasn't thinking about winning. He was just thinking about her. The morning after the storm, the farm looked like it had been through a battle. The ground was still slick with mud, the broken fence posts scattered like fallen soldiers. A few trees had been uprooted near the property line, their massive roots exposed to the morning light. The barn had held strong, but one of the smaller sheds near the cattle pens hadn't been so lucky. Daniel stood near the fence line, sleeves rolled up, hands on his hips as he surveyed the damage. His muscles ached from the night before, but he barely noticed. The adrenaline still lingered in his system. The image of the horses running wild through the storm burned into his mind. Serena was already at work, securing the fence. She moved with the same relentless energy she always did, as if exhaustion didn't exist in her world. He had never met anyone like her. He was beginning to think he never would again. But something about today felt different. There was a weight in the air, something unspoken lingering between them. He had felt it last night, too, when she had squeezed his arm after they got the horses back. It had been brief, barely noticeable, but he had felt it nonetheless. Trust, or at least the beginning of it, and that terrified him more than anything. By midday, most of the immediate repairs were underway. The cattle had been checked, the horses calmed. The ranch hands worked quickly, moving through their tasks with quiet efficiency. Daniel found himself working alongside them, which was still a strange sensation. He wasn't used to working with people. He was used to commanding them, but out here, that didn't matter. He had learned that the hard way. Serena barely acknowledged him for most of the morning, though he could feel her watching him. Then, just after lunch, a sleek black car rolled up the dirt road leading to the farm. Daniel recognized it immediately. Marcus Whitley. His stomach twisted in a way he didn't like. He had barely thought about the bet in the last few weeks. At first, it had been everything. His reason for being here, his motivation. But somewhere along the way, it had faded into the background, drowned out by the relentless rhythm of the farm, by Serena herself. Now, seeing Marcus step out of the car in his perfectly pressed suit, it all came rushing back. This wasn't real. None of it. It had started as a game, a challenge. And now, with Marcus standing here like a ghost from his old life, he was being forced to remember exactly who he was. Serena approached, wiping her hands on a rag, her expression unreadable. "Friend of yours?" Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "Something like that." Marcus, of course, was already smirking. "I have to say," he drawled, glancing around, "this is not what I expected when I sent you off on this little adventure." Daniel clenched his jaw. "What do you want, Marcus?" Marcus shrugged, stepping forward. "Just checking in. It's been weeks, and you've been unusually quiet. I figured I'd find you miserable, counting the days until you could get back to civilization." His smirk deepened. "But you look comfortable." Daniel didn't respond. Serena frowned, arms still crossed. "You mind telling me what's going on here?" Marcus turned to her, his sharp gaze assessing. "So, you're the lucky woman who landed the Daniel Richmond?" Serena's expression didn't change. "Something tells me lucky isn't the word you want to use." Marcus chuckled. "Smart and sharp-tongued. I see the appeal." He turned back to Daniel. "I hate to interrupt whatever domestic bliss you've got going on here, but I figured I'd remind you of something." Daniel already knew what was coming. "The bet," Marcus said, grinning. "You do remember, don't you?" Serena stiffened beside him. Daniel exhaled, closing his eyes for a brief second before meeting Marcus's gaze. "Now is not the time." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Oh, now isn't the time? Why, because you started enjoying yourself?" He laughed. "Oh, this is better than I expected. I thought you'd be counting down the days, but look at you." Serena turned to Daniel, her gaze sharp now. "What bet?" Daniel felt the world tilt beneath him. Damn it. He turned to her, every muscle in his body tightening. "Serena, let's talk about this later." But that was the wrong thing to say. Serena stepped back, eyes narrowing. "No, we'll talk about it now." Marcus, of course, looked entirely entertained. "Oh, you didn't tell her?" He let out a low whistle. "That's cold, even for you." Daniel wanted to strangle him. Serena crossed her arms. "Tell me now, Daniel." His mouth went dry. He had faced down billion-dollar negotiations, handled ruthless competitors, crushed entire corporations under his heel. And yet, standing here in front of Serena Brooks, he felt like the weakest man alive. Because there was no way to spin this. No way to make it sound right. But she deserved the truth. So he gave it to her. "I made a bet," he admitted, "with Marcus. He challenged me to marry someone who wasn't from my world, to stay married for 6 months. Serena didn't move, didn't blink. The silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. "And if you won?" she finally asked, voice dangerously quiet. Daniel's throat felt tight. $50 million worth of investment into my company. There it was. The truth laid bare between them like an open wound. For the first time since he had met Serena, she looked at him like he was a stranger, like he was someone she had never known. "You—" Her voice cracked just slightly. She swallowed, shaking her head. "You married me for a bet?" Daniel took a step forward. "Serena." She stepped back, and that hurt more than it should have. Marcus, sensing the tension, exhaled. "Well, this is awkward." Serena's head snapped toward him. "Get off my land." Marcus lifted his hands. "Hey, don't shoot the messenger. Get off my land." Marcus, for once, didn't argue. He cast Daniel one last glance, part amusement, part warning, before walking back to his car. Daniel barely noticed. His focus was on Serena. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't throwing things. She just looked at him. And that was worse, because it meant she was done. "Serena," he said quietly, carefully, "I swear, this stopped being about the bet a long time ago." Her jaw tightened. "You don't get to say that," she said, Daniel's chest constricted. "I didn't—" "You used me," she interrupted, voice raw. "This whole time you made me think—" She exhaled, pressing a hand against her forehead. "I let you into my home. I let you into my life." "I know," he whispered. "No, you don't." She shook her head. "Because this isn't a game to me, Daniel. This isn't some corporate deal you can twist in your favor. This is my life, my family's life." Daniel felt the words hit like blows. He wanted to fix this. But some things couldn't be fixed. Serena inhaled sharply. "I want you gone." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Serena, I want you gone," she repeated, voice cold, final. "By morning." Daniel opened his mouth, but there was nothing left to say, because he had already lost. And for the first time in his life, he realized winning wasn't the point anymore. Daniel Richmond had built his life on winning. He had never lost, not in business, not in negotiations, not in his personal dealings. But as he drove away from Serena Brooks' farm that morning, his hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded, he knew without a doubt, this time he had lost. The weight in his chest wasn't something he could ignore. It wasn't just disappointment or frustration. It was something deeper, something more raw. Regret. He had never thought himself capable of feeling something like that, not truly. Regret was for people who made mistakes they couldn't fix. And Daniel had always been the kind of man who found a way to fix anything. But as the farm disappeared in his rearview mirror, as the dust settled behind his car, he realized some things couldn't be fixed. Some things, once broken, stayed broken. And maybe, just maybe, that was his fault. Back in New York, everything was the same. The towering buildings, the glass and steel fortresses, the endless cityscape stretching in every direction. It should have felt like home. It should have been a relief to return to the world he had mastered, where every move was calculated, every decision a step toward greater power. Instead, it felt hollow. He walked into his penthouse, the pristine perfection of it suddenly suffocating. There was no dirt here, no scent of fresh air, no sound of animals or the distant hum of the wind. Just silence. He had spent weeks at the farm without thinking about his old life, without longing for this place. Now, standing in the middle of his vast, perfectly decorated living room, he realized why. It wasn't real. Not in the way the farm had been. Not in the way she had been. His phone buzzed. He ignored it. His assistant had left messages. His business partners wanted updates. Marcus had sent a smug text that he didn't even bother to read. None of it mattered. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel didn't care about the world he had built. He cared about what he had lost. And that was a problem. Days passed, then weeks. Daniel threw himself into work. It was the only thing he knew how to do when things spiraled out of control. Meetings, acquisitions, boardroom discussions, he buried himself in all of it, trying to drown out the nagging voice in his head that kept whispering her name. Serena, her voice, her sharp wit, the way she moved through the farm like she was part of it, like it was part of her. The way she had looked at him when she learned the truth, like he was nothing. It haunted him. More than that, it changed him. Because the worst part wasn't that she had thrown him out. It was that he had deserved it. And he wasn't sure how to live with that. One evening, long after the sun had set and the city lights cast their artificial glow across his penthouse, Daniel did something he never thought he'd do. He researched farms, not for profit, not for expansion, just to understand. And as he read about sustainability, about small farming businesses struggling to compete with corporate takeovers, something clicked. Serena's fight hadn't just been about pride. It had been about survival, about protecting something that had been in her family for generations, about making sure her father's legacy didn't disappear under the weight of financial burdens. And Daniel had walked into her life offering a deal that, to her, had been no different from the corporate wolves trying to take everything from her. He had never understood before. But now, he did. And that changed everything. The next morning, Daniel made a decision. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about profit. He wasn't thinking about winning or power plays. He was thinking about doing something right. He called his assistant. "I want to set up a fund," he said. Victoria, ever professional, didn't question it. For what purpose? To support independent farms, he said. Landowners like Serena Brooks. People who are trying to keep their businesses alive without being forced to sell to corporations. There was a brief silence. "Did I hear that correctly?" Victoria asked, cautious. "You want to help small farmers?" "Yes." Another pause. "Forgive me, sir, but that doesn't sound like you." Daniel exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah," he muttered. "I know." Victoria, to her credit, didn't argue. "I'll start drafting the paperwork." And just like that, Daniel Richmond, the man who had built his empire on ruthless business tactics, was about to invest millions into something that had no direct benefit to him. He didn't care, because this wasn't about him. Not anymore. Months passed. Daniel didn't reach out to Serena. He didn't try to fix what had happened between them, because he knew trust wasn't something you won back with words. It was something you earned. And if he ever wanted to stand in front of her again, if he ever wanted her to look at him without that cold, empty stare, he had to prove that he wasn't the man she thought he was. So, he worked. The fund was established. Small farms across the country started receiving grants, financial assistance, resources to help them stay afloat without corporate buyouts. And through it all, he didn't once put his name on it. This wasn't about recognition. It was about making things right. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Victoria entered his office holding a document. "You might want to see this." Daniel took it, scanning the page. It was an article, a feature on the farming fund, on how it had helped dozens of struggling farmers keep their land, on how it had already made a real difference. And there, at the bottom of the article, a quote from Serena Brooks. He stared at it for a long time. It wasn't much, just a few words about how the fund had helped, how she was grateful for the support but remained cautious of outside investors. But it meant one thing. She knew. She knew what he had done, and she hadn't dismissed it outright. That was enough, for now. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't chasing the next deal. He was chasing something far more important. And if it took months, years, however long it needed, he would wait. Because Serena Brooks had once told him that trust had to be earned. And Daniel Richmond was finally ready to do just that. Daniel Richmond had never been a patient man. His life had been built on swift decisions, immediate results, and an unwavering belief that if he wanted something, he could make it happen. Deals closed in days, negotiations settled in hours. He didn't wait, he acted. But when it came to Serena Brooks, waiting was the only thing he could do. It had been months since he left the farm. Months since she told him to get out, since she looked at him like he was nothing. And in those months, Daniel had done something he never thought possible. He had let go of control. For the first time in his life, he hadn't chased a win. He hadn't tried to fix things with quick words or expensive gestures. He had simply done the work. He had built something that mattered, not for profit, not for power, but because it was the right thing to do. And now, as he stood outside a newly built community center in rural Montana, he realized something else. He had changed. Not because he wanted Serena back, but because he wanted to be the kind of man who deserved a second chance. The grand opening of the new Rise Up Farming Initiative Center was a big deal for the local community. Farmers from all over the state had come to celebrate, many of them beneficiaries of the fund Daniel had created. The center would serve as a hub for education, financial support, and sustainable farming resources, a place where independent farmers could come for real help, not just empty promises. And Serena was here. Daniel spotted her the moment he arrived. She was standing near the entrance, dressed in her usual work clothes, jeans, boots, a simple flannel shirt. She was talking to a group of other farmers, listening intently, nodding along as they spoke. She looked stronger, more sure of herself than ever, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest at the sight of her, but he didn't approach. Not yet. He wasn't here to push. He wasn't here to demand anything from her. He was here to see what she thought, not what he could convince her to think. So he waited. And then, after nearly an hour of standing on the periphery, Serena finally saw him. Their eyes met across the crowd. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Serena excused herself from the conversation she was having and walked toward him. Daniel forced himself to stay still, to not move toward her first, to not try to read too much into the way her expression remained carefully neutral. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed. "You're here," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. "I am." Serena tilted her head slightly. "Didn't think this was your kind of event." Daniel exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "It wasn't. Now it is." A beat of silence passed between them. Serena studied him, her sharp brown eyes searching for something. He had no idea if she found it. Finally, she glanced around, at the people, at the center, at everything this initiative had become. "You did this," she said. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Another silence. Then, softly, "Why?" Daniel held her gaze. "Because it was the right thing to do." Serena blinked. Not the answer she was expecting. He could tell. For a long time, she said nothing. Then she turned slightly, looking back toward the community center. "This is a good thing," she admitted. "A lot of people will be helped because of it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "That's the point." Serena glanced at him again, and for the first time in months, there wasn't anger in her expression. Just something quieter, something softer. Daniel's chest tightened. She wasn't forgiving him, not yet, maybe not ever, but she was seeing him again, and that was something. The event went on. Daniel didn't leave. He didn't hover either. He talked to people, listened, answered questions. He wasn't just here for her, and that, he knew, mattered more than anything. Serena noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. She watched the way he interacted with the farmers, the way he didn't try to assert dominance, didn't try to take credit for anything. This wasn't about him, and that, more than anything, was what made her pause. Because the Daniel Richmond she had met months ago would have never been capable of this. By the time the event started winding down, Daniel had accepted that this was as much of a conversation as he was going to get from Serena today, and that was okay. But then, as he was preparing to leave, she found him again. He turned, surprised, as she stepped up beside him near the parking lot. "I read about what you've been doing," she said. Daniel didn't ask what, he already knew. Serena shifted, crossing her arms. "I thought it was just guilt, that you were throwing money at something to make yourself feel better." Daniel nodded. "I figured you would," she exhaled sharply, "but then I kept watching." Daniel stayed silent. Serena's jaw tightened slightly. "You didn't stop." "No." Another pause, then softer. "Why?" Daniel met her gaze. "Because I didn't do this for you." Serena blinked, caught off guard. Daniel continued, voice steady. "I started because of you, but I kept going because it was the right thing to do, and because I didn't like the man I was before." Serena inhaled, exhaling slowly. Then she asked the question he had been waiting for. "And who are you now?" Daniel hesitated, then, "Someone who's still figuring it out." Serena nodded once. Not acceptance, not rejection, but an acknowledgement, and that, for now, was enough. Months later, Daniel found himself back at the farm. Not because he had been invited, not because he was trying to fix things, but because he had been in the area and he had something to deliver. He knocked on the front door, waiting. Then, after a moment, Serena opened it. She stared at him for a long second. Then she sighed. "What are you doing here, Richmond?" Daniel smirked slightly. "I have something for you." She narrowed her eyes. "If it's money, it's not." He held up a folder. Serena frowned but took it. She flipped it open, then froze. Daniel watched as she scanned the documents. The title deed, her farm, paid off, every last cent of debt gone. Serena's breath hitched. "You—" "No strings," Daniel said, voice quiet. "No deals, no favors, just yours." Serena swallowed, and for the first time she looked at him like she wasn't sure what to do with him. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the villain she had made him out to be. Like maybe, just maybe, he was someone else entirely. A second chance, not a promise, not a guarantee, just a possibility. And for Daniel Richmond, that was enough, for now. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss our latest videos. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Check out our other stories for more compelling content. See you in the next one.